Good morning, everyone. I am a volunteer from the IIH Colombian chapter, and I welcome you to our 5 cycle of groundwater talks. We really appreciate your support to our chapter and join us with our volunteer activities. I want to thank all the people that has been following for this groundwater talks initiative, and we are glad because this week is our last week of groundwater talks. And right now in our YouTube channel, we have more than 2,000 views and more than 300 followers. So thank you so much for your support. I am showing the schedule for this week. So we will have a change on the Thursday and Friday talk. So we will confirm tomorrow to you guys who will be the speaker for tomorrow, for Thursday and Friday, because maybe Jacinto will be the speaker on Thursday, and on Friday another person will be the speaker. So we are trying to confirm the people because they have some issues with the internet connection. So that is the thing. Remember that our talk today will be 1 hour, 45 minutes for our speaker and 15 minutes for questions. And remember to leave your questions through our YouTube channel. So now it's time to present our speaker from today. So today we will have Dr. Jim Valor. He is a senior science in the geohydrology section of Kansas Geological Survey at the University of Kansas. He holds a bachelor's degree in geology from the College of William and Mary, and a Master of Science and PhD applied to hydrogeology from the Stanford University. His research interests include assessment of aquifers that support irrigated agriculture, high-resolution subsurface characterization, well responses to natural and anthropogenic stimuli, and role of pretophytes. I don't know, Dr. Valerie, if I am right with the pronunciation, maybe not. So maybe after be clear in the words. In stream aquifer systems, and he has held visiting research position at Sandia National Laboratory, the University of Valencia, and Stanford University. So, Dr. Valor, thank you so much for joining us to this initiative. And please forgive me for my pronunciation, and you are welcome today.
Okay, well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a pleasure to join you this morning, albeit under far from ideal circumstances. I trust everyone is doing as well as could be expected given the situation. Here in Kansas, well, here in Lawrence, Kansas, where I'm located, we have just ended our 8th week of quarantine or lockdown. And today I'm giving this presentation from my work office because of the better internet connection than at home. And this is the first time I've spent any time in my work office in the last 8 weeks. So, and we're unclear about exactly how much longer we have, but we are hopeful, and I encourage all of you to be hopeful as well that we will get through this. Now, just a couple words about my background. One thing that was phreatophytes, that's on stream aquifer systems was a topic that I studied a while back, but I was trained as a numerical modeler. And in the latter part of my training, I realized that we just didn't have the data to fully realize the potential of the great potential of the modeling endeavor. So I resolved in my career to try to spend time working on methods, approaches that get us better information about the subsurface. and specifically the shallow subsurface. So I've spent a lot of time working on various well tests and other subsurface characterization methods. And about 10 years ago, I started working on a more general problem, and that is, well, a more global issue of more global significance, and that is the future of aquifers supporting irrigated agriculture. And I think everyone recognizes the global importance of this issue. We've got these regional aquifers across the world that are providing badly needed agricultural production, and they're under a lot of stress. And this stress is just going to continue to mount as the population continues to grow, changes in diet, and the changing climate as well. And we need to try to see if we can get these aquifers onto a more sustainable path. And so that's what I've been working on. And I'm going to talk a bit about that today with the focus on the High Plains Aquifer. I think many of you are familiar with the High Plains Aquifer. This is one of the world's largest, most important regional aquifers, covers 8 states in the central US, provides the water to support a large amount of the US grain production, and it's been intensively utilized. The groundwater of the High Plains Aquifer has been intensively utilized, and Kansas is no exception. Now, I've extracted Kansas from the rest of the aquifer here. I guess that would be kind of a light brown color is the aquifer itself in the western half, the third to half of the state. The darker brown is similar geologic material, but just without the saturated thickness. Now, we have intensively utilized this aquifer as an example. In terms of daily water use in the state of Kansas, more than 70% of it is groundwater from the High Plains Aquifer. And if you just restrict yourself to irrigation water, that's probably like 95% of the water used for irrigation in the state of Kansas is from the High Plains Aquifer. And this intensive use is nothing new. We've been doing this for decades, and there's been a price paid in terms of aquifer conditions. And I just wanted to illustrate that price here. This is a map of the percent change in aquifer thickness since the onset of widespread pumping for irrigated agriculture, since pre-development, which is late 1940s, early 1950s in the state of Kansas. What you're looking at here is a colored map. The color blue is in areas of aquifer increase over this time period since the onset of widespread pumping. All the other colors are areas of decrease, and the deepest reds are areas where more than 60% of the aquifer is gone. And I should note that in the western third of the state, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but these bluish areas in the western third of the state are areas that were very thin aquifer to begin with, so they're not of practical importance. Now, in these deepest red areas, we've got over 60% of the aquifers gone, and in some of these areas, the percent is much greater. And as a result, some of these areas, we've seen the conversion of irrigated land to dry land agriculture. And of course, the productivity decreases, and of course, the income for the farmers decreases as well. Now, we get a lot of questions at the Kansas Geological Survey about what the future holds for this aquifer. And if we just continue business as usual, just do as we've done for the last 20 some years, the decline rates will just continue, and it is not going to end well. And that's what I tell the folks when they ask me. Now, then they ask, what can we do to moderate the rate of decline? Is there any chance of stabilizing water levels in this area? And in western Kansas, there's virtually no surface water because all of the streams were groundwater, virtually all of the streams were groundwater fed streams, but now the water table has dropped below the bottom of the streams. And so all of those streams have gone dry. So there's no surface water, virtually no surface water that we can turn to. So our only option is to reduce pumping. And so then the question becomes, how much do we need to reduce pumping to have a significant impact on these decline rates? And that's what I'm going to focus on today. And to get at that question, we need data. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the type of data that we work with. Now in Kansas, for decades, we've had an annual water level measurement program where teams from the Kansas Geological Survey and the Water Regulatory Agency here in the state go out in early January and measure water levels in a network of approximately 1,400 wells across the High Plains aquifers. And these individual dots that you see here are those wells. And it's the data from those wells that allows us to create maps as you're showing here. We do it in January because that's 3 to 4 months after the cessation of irrigation pumping. So we don't want to have year-to-year variations in the timing of the end of the irrigation season to have a heavy impact on these readings. So we space them 3 to 4 months after the end of the irrigation season. Now this enables us to see how water levels have changed over time, but that change is just a response to our stress or an excitation. And so we need information on that excitation, which of course is the pumping of groundwater. Now in Kansas, I'm pleased to say that we are the US leaders and maybe even the world leaders in terms of monitoring pumping. Because in Kansas, if you have a high capacity pumping well now, you have to have a totalizing flow meter with that well, and you have to report the amounts annually, and it's subject to regulatory oversight. So the regulatory agency can come onto your land with a calibrated ultrasonic flow meter, clamp it next to yours, and you have to be within 6% of the reading. Otherwise, you have to get it fixed, or if you've tried to trick the flow meter, then you can lose your ability to pump groundwater. So as a result, we have great information over the last 2 decades on how much we've pumped from this aquifer. About 95 to 98% of the high capacity wells in the High Plains aquifer have these flow meters, and this is a great data set for us. So we have both the excitation and we have the response. So what can we do with that? Well, I just want to talk about a method that we've come up with using this idealized cross-section through an unconfined aquifer. You've got the aquifer water balance equation, and you can see that all these different arrows here, and these are just example components of the aquifer water balance. It's not an all-inclusive list, but it captures the major players. Now, one of the goals of numerical modeling is, of course, to quantify each one of these components of the water balance. But frankly, that is very difficult to do on the scale of regional modeling. It's just very difficult for us to quantify that with any reliability. So one of the things we decided to do is take a step back and recognize that we are unable to characterize every one of these components. So we lump the difficult to characterize components into a single term that we call net inflow. And so net inflow is everything flowing into the aquifer minus everything flowing out, save pumping. So all these gray components are what constitute this net inflow term. And then you can see the value of this expression. So if people ask, how much do we need to pump to stabilize water levels? Well, the left-hand side, water volume change in aquifer, if you're stabilized, the level is 0. And so then the pumping equals the net inflow. So that's what we need to be shooting for, a pumping equal to this net inflow. The question is, how do we know what this net inflow is? And this is where we've been able to develop an approach to estimate that net inflow from field data. And I'm not going to go into the derivation. It can be found in this paper that I've got listed on the screen and an earlier one in Geophysical Research Letters that show how we do that. And I'm just going to show the type of plot that we use to get at this. what I've got here is for an area in Northwest Kansas. It's a 256 square kilometers. And we've got average annual water level change for that area on the y-axis in meters. And then we've got annual water use there on the x-axis. And according to this, the theory of this approach we've developed, this should be a linear relationship. And as you can see, working with real data, that is a very close to a linear relationship with r squared at 0.86. We don't have data for 2006 and 2007 because of a large snowstorm that prevented us from getting that data. So we can fit a line to this relationship, and from the slope of that line, you can estimate specific yield. And then you can estimate the net inflow from the slope and the intercept. So then we can directly calculate how much you need to reduce pumping in order to stabilize water levels. And obviously, if you have less, if you say I want to reduce the rate of decline by 50%, you can also calculate that as well. So this is the first approach that's been developed so that we can calculate these badly needed quantities directly from field data. And so we've been able to take these the approaches, the information from these plots, the specific yield can then go into a numerical model for the area. But I just want to show you a quick, give you a feel for the reductions, pumping reductions needed to stabilize water levels for the near term. This would be a few decades, maybe a little bit more. And this is a percent from average annual pumping. And I've just got it for the 3 major areas in Western Kansas. So you can see from the upper 20s to the lower 30s in terms of percent reductions required. Now, that's the percent that would stabilize water levels on average over the area. Obviously, some areas, the water levels would continue to rise, to drop with this reduction. Other areas, they would rise. But on average, it would be stable. So the question then becomes, okay, we can see what is required to stabilize water levels. What is the potential for actually implementing those reductions? And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about groundwater management, because this becomes critical for trying to implement such reduction plans. Now, United States, groundwater management is a state responsibility, not a federal responsibility, a state responsibility. So that every state has its own way of doing things. And so it can make for quite a variation. Now in Kansas, we have a single agency, a single regulatory agency that manages the groundwater and the surface water as an integrated system. And that's very important. That's not done by all the states. Those are separate entities. And sometimes there's not a full recognition of their interconnection in the regulatory arena. And this, the agency in Kansas is the Division of Water Resources, and it's in the Kansas Department of Agriculture. So we've got this groundwater management in Kansas, and the other aspect, or one other aspect I wanted to talk about is groundwater rights in Kansas. So in Kansas, the state owns the water. You do not, as a landowner, you do not own the water. And each one of these red dots, I should have noticed, pointed this out earlier, is a well pumping groundwater, which has a right to pump groundwater. And you should notice how there's a concentration of wells in the High Plains Aquifer in the south central part of the state, and then in the western part of the state, you can see the high concentration of pumping wells. So the state owns the water. You can obtain a right to pump groundwater for beneficial use, such as irrigation. And we have our water right allocation a doctrine is based on prior appropriation. So that means the first in time, the first in right. So the earlier the water right is, the higher its priority. And so a later right cannot impair or negatively impact a significant, to a significant amount, a more senior right. If it does, there's something called Water Rights Administration, where the regulatory agency can come in and decrease the pumping of the junior water right, or even shut it off entirely. So the water right consists of an authorized quantity. You can pump up to a certain amount each year, and that is monitored closely, as I said. And if you pump above your authorized quantity, you can get penalized, both in terms of monetary penalties, as well as you can lose your access to pump. You can have your water rights suspended for 1 or 2 or more years, which of course has a huge impact on your ability to make much money. So groundwater rights. So we have a regulatory agency, we have these groundwater rights, and one other aspect of groundwater management in Kansas I wanted to touch upon, because it has bearings on this, the issue of reductions in pumping, is the groundwater management district. Or these groundwater management districts established in the 1970s. There are 5 groundwater management districts in Kansas. They overlie the High Plains Aquifer. The idea behind these is that they will assist the regulatory agency in groundwater management, allowing some local input into decisions, and they can come up with their own initiatives for management in their area. And this is, of course, it has to be within the framework of Kansas water law and be approved by the regulatory agency, but they can take initiatives. And the initiative that I want to talk about today is one that was taken by this groundwater management district in Northwest Kansas, groundwater management district number 4, and it's called the Local Enhanced Management Area, or LEMA. And the idea here, it's very simple. What I've got here, I've got 2 maps, groundwater pumping density here on the upper left, and I apologize, this is in English units. I just suddenly realized that. The interpretation is the hotter the colors, the heavier the pumping. So notice that there's an area here in Northwest Kansas of relatively high pumping density for that area. And then on the lower right, we have water level changes over the same period as the pumping density distribution. And you'll notice again with the water level change, that same area has been stressed more heavily than elsewhere in that vicinity. So the farmers in that area got together and said, hey, we want to preserve this resource for our kids and grandkids. And this local enhanced management area idea came out of that. And the idea here is that folks get together and they say, we want to preserve this resource. We want to cut pumping by a certain amount. And if they all vote, if the majority vote to do so, then everyone in the area has to follow that plan. And then the state regulatory agency comes in and makes sure that everyone's playing by the agreed upon rules. This is very important. So it's a locally generated plan, but it is supported by regulatory oversight. So people can have confidence that everyone's playing by the agreed upon rules. And so the first one of these was set up in this circled area in January of 2013. It's 256 square kilometers. And the question, and well, let me back up and say their goal was to reduce pumping by 20%, average annual pumping by 20%. And the way they did it is they gave everybody a 5-year volume of water that they could pump however they wanted in that 5-year period. But they couldn't exceed that total volume. So they could use it all in 2 or 3 years and then just not irrigate to the other years if need be. So that was their goal. They started in 2013. And the question is, how have they done? And so one of the tasks that we had was to try to answer that question. How have these guys done in their effort to reduce pumping? and to extend the lifespan of the aquifer in their area. And so what we did was we came up with a simple approach. It involves plotting annual water use, which you see on the y-axis, versus annual precipitation. And you could use seasonal, you could use irrigation season precipitation as well. For simplicity, I'm just using annual precipitation. Because one of the things we had noted in our studies of the High Plains Aquifer is that water use versus annual precipitation produced a linear relationship, which is not surprising. You're pumping when it's dry, you're not pumping when it's raining. And so nice linear relationship. There's some noise here, but it's really not bad. So that's the pre-Lima period before they set up and move forward with the pumping reductions. So now they've gone forward, done the pumping reductions, and how have they done? Well, this is the record after the implementation of these pumping reductions. And I think you can see that they truly have made a difference. 3 points I wanted to make here. Notice this red dashed line is clearly set off below the blue, below the range there in the blue. Notice that it's a much tighter, you got an R-squared of 0.98, and I attribute that to simply due to the increased monitoring of pumping once this agreement was made. The regulatory agency came in and intensively monitored water use to make sure everyone was doing as they had agreed upon. The third point I wanted to make here is you can see they have not experienced dry conditions yet. So this program, I've got, 6 years plotted up here. It's gone through a 7th year, which was wet again. And so they've been fortunate. So the question still remains, how will they do under drought conditions? But they have done pretty well so far. And the result is for similar climatic conditions, they've reduced pumping by about 30%. So they've exceeded what they were setting out to do when you control for climate conditions. And the result in terms of water level decline rate has been around 69%. And so they have done quite well in terms of achieving what they had set out to do. Now, this decline rate, if they could continue that reduction of that amount into the future, they would triple the lifespan of the aquifer. However, it's going to be difficult to do so because when you reduce pumping, you also impact this net inflow quantity. So let's go back to this cross section here that I presented earlier. Again, you've got net inflow is everything flowing out minus everything flowing in, save pumping. So all these gray components. So if you reduce pumping, how is that going to impact this net inflow? Well, this return flow component will diminish. And oftentimes these vertical and lateral inflow terms will change as well because you've reduced the drawdown perhaps relative to neighboring areas. However, given the inertia of groundwater systems, and in this case, our depth to water is about 50 meters. The average depth to water exceeds 50 meters in this area. So it's going to take a while for that return flow signal to make it down to the aquifer. And so until the net inflow changes, they're going to be doing very well in terms of extending the lifespan of the aquifer. But then the net inflow will eventually change. And the question becomes, how much will it change? And what is the time frame of those changes? And that's something that we're investigating, excuse me, with both modeling on the modeling side as well as in the field. And we've been able to assess how things have changed so far in this aquifer via a plotting approach that I presented earlier, which is average annual water level change versus annual water use. And these are the data prior to establishment of this Lima, prior to any cutbacks in pumping. And you've got a nice linear relationship. Now, if net inflow remains constant, you will just slide up this line as pumping is reduced. But the question is, has it, now that they've started the program? And you can see what I've got here is the first 4 years of the program, and it appears certainly that they have been able to do the pumping reductions, and there's been no impact yet on net inflow. Now, I apologize here. Let me just say I apologize for only presenting the first 4 years here. I had another plot that I was going to put in this morning, but then I discovered it was in English units and it would be difficult to try to move back and forth. So I just went with the first 4 years. We have another 3 years of data onto this, and when you put in those additional 3 data points, this dash line, which is both the pre-Lima and Lima data fit, does not change. R-squared doesn't change at all. Turns out that 2019 was one of the wettest years, in the last 50. I think it's the second wettest year in the last 50 and one of the wettest years in the last century. And actually, the water level increased by about 24 centimeters in 2019. So they actually started getting a significant rise in water levels, which is very good to see. But the bottom line is, as of now, they've made the reductions, and through the first 7 years of this program, they have not seen a decline in net inflow. But it will occur eventually. And when it does, this dashed line will move downward, as shown by the arrow, as the amount of water supplied by net inflow decreases. So when you pump out a certain volume, you're going to get more drawdown in response. And so if they want to continue to diminish the rate of decline at the rate they have during the Lima period, so far, they would need further reductions in water use in order to do so. But we're still unclear about the timing of all of this. And so we continue to monitor this through time, because this is how we can get some insights, some very valuable insights about the response of the system to pumping reductions that are going to be difficult to obtain via otherwise. Of course, modeling investigations, very important, but really the gold standard are the data. How have they responded? How have the water levels responded to these reductions? So this is going to be important activity for my colleagues and I for the foreseeable future, just to be able to track how the system responds to these pumping reductions in the coming years. So based on this, it appears that this Lima concept, where people get together, they agree upon that they're going to make a certain amount of reductions, and then the state regulatory agency comes in and ensures everyone is playing by the agreed upon rules. We think this has great potential because, again, it's a locally generated plan. It's not a top-down, some regulatory head telling you what you have to do. The farmers come together and realize that if they're going to have this resource, continue to use this resource, they've got to act. And so we think this has great potential. And in the state of Kansas, it is beginning to get more attention. The area that I talked about was only 256 square kilometers in Northwest Kansas. So it's a very small area. But now, as a result of the success of that program, the Lima concept has now extended to that entire district, which is over 12,600 square kilometers. So that is the progress we like to see, because it's going to have to be on large scale that we make these reductions. In West Central Kansas, they're also moving forward with this concept. And even in South Central Kansas, where they don't have a big problem with depletion, they do have some problems with stream depletion as a result of pumping. So they're thinking about applying a similar concept there. Now, the Southwest Kansas, the GMD3 is the largest user of groundwater in the state, and they have yet to move forward with such a program. There are some other kind of modifications of this concept that are being applied in certain areas in that district, but as of yet, very little activity in comparison to their neighbors to the north. What they're banking on as of this point is large-scale water transfers coming from the Missouri rivers, which is way over here in northwest and southwest, northeast Kansas, excuse me, that there would be a canal taking the water from the upper northeast corner of the state out west. And maybe that'll eventually come to pass, but it's not going to come to pass anytime soon in the next 50 or 60 years, probably simply because of all the challenges involved in constructing such a project and with the lawsuits, et cetera. So this LEMA concept, we're hoping will eventually get down there. And if so, I think we can make real progress in Kansas. Now, we're not achieving sustainability, but what we are doing is we're significantly extending the lifespan of the aquifer with the hope that technology, maybe large-scale water transfers and other means perhaps can help us eventually get to a near sustainable state. But at this point, we are not. The water levels are continuing to decline, and it's our hope is that concepts like this can help us and moderate those rate of declines and get onto a more sustainable path. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. I want to leave you with just 3 major points, and just illustrated with this map here that shows the situation we're currently in, which is not very good in Western Kansas. And it's clearly the hour is late. It's only now that we're really focusing on doing something about this problem. And in the areas where they're really moving forward with these concepts, most of these areas have had already very large, significant declines, like in the area of that 256 square kilometer area in Northwest Kansas, where this was initiated, a significant portion of that area, they had lost over 60% of the aquifer. So it's a little late, but it's good to see folks moving forward. The second point is the only option that we have for the next few to several decades is to reduce pumping. And we're hopeful that pumping can be reduced, and yet agricultural production can continue via new technologies, precision agriculture, big data, crop shifts, crop genetics, et cetera. That's what we have to move forward with, and we're hopeful that that will lead us into a more sustainable condition. But finally, the most important point is we're very fortunate in Kansas that we have data on how much water is being pumped from our aquifer, because without that, we would have very difficult time trying to figure out what to do. The basic idea is you cannot manage what you do not know. And so I think not just in the US, but across the globe, we need to have a much stronger focus on monitoring water use. If we can do it in the state of Kansas, which is not the most liberal state in the United States by far, but folks realize that if we're going to manage this, we've got to have the data to base decisions on. Otherwise, it becomes a very uncertain activity. So this is something that we're trying to stress in publications and in presentations. We have to be able to do a better job in monitoring water use if we're going to make significant progress in this area. And with that, I was trying to hold to 45 minutes, so maybe I went a little fast, but I'd be happy to take questions. Just some acknowledgments. This work was done in cooperation with my colleagues, longtime colleagues at the Kansas Geological Survey, Don Whittemore, Jeff Bowling, Brownie Wilson, and our work has been supported by funding agencies both in Kansas and then at the federal level as well. And for those of you wanting more information about the High Plains Aquifer, we have at the Kansas Geological Survey website, we have this Kansas High Plains Aquifer Atlas that has lots and lots of information about, lots of maps about the current status of the aquifer. And so I'd encourage you to go there if you're interested in learning more. Also, my colleagues and I have a series of publications over the last few years focused on this topic, and you can see them listed here. And we're continuing to move forward in this area. So this would be where we really go into the details of the material that I presented today. And with that speedy overview of what we've done, I will say thank you and certainly open it up to any questions that the audience might have. And I appreciate your viewing this presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Butler, for your talk. Really interesting talk. So we have a question from Tanis. Tanis is asking about is there any work towards artificial research for the aquifer or use of treated water for irrigation?
Well, in the far, let me go back. I'm just going to hop back to a slide, a couple slides back here. In the far eastern portion of the aquifer, can you see my cursor here?
Yes, I can see.
In this area of the aquifer, we have surface water, and there are some large-scale aquifer storage and recovery projects there going on there. Now, as we go west, you may see what look like rivers here. These are just dry sand beds because we have just dried up the river. And this is a major river that comes in from Colorado. It has water, and then about here, the water stops, and we just have this long stretch, and it's only maybe up here that we start getting flow again. So we just don't have the water for to do any aquifer storage and recovery. Now, the local municipalities in Western Kansas, they are using recycled wet wastewater for like irrigating their parks, this sort of thing. So they're trying to use that, yes. But in terms of large scale, we just don't have that. And the cities in Western Kansas are in the size of, I'm just now talking off the top of my head, maybe 25, 30,000 maximum in terms of be the largest city. So it's not like it's a major metropolitan area. So we just don't have the water in Western Kansas for some sort of ASR type project.
Okay, we have another question from the Carlos Molano. He is asking, is there any GW conflict with the neighbors' states, induced depletion, for example?
Well, we have major conflicts with Colorado. Let me rephrase that. We have had major conflicts with Colorado to our west and Nebraska to our north. Now, those have all been, they've primarily been surface water. We have these federal, I guess you'd call them treaties between states that they are supposed to provide us with a certain amount of water. And in Nebraska, for example, there are a lot of pumping of the alluvial aquifer along one of the major rivers, the Republican rivers, depleted the river flow. And so that is an example where the groundwater activity of our neighbors has impacted us. But in terms of pumping, well, the cone of depression coming across the border, and you see that in some of the states to our east, we just don't have that problem to any degree. Now, from our western neighbor, Colorado, the surface water that they supply us is very high in uranium, unfortunately, because it's just a naturally concentrated, evapotranspiratively concentrated, because they've got shallow reservoirs and a lot of irrigation in eastern Colorado. So we get this very poor quality water, which then seeps into the High Plains Aquifer. And so it's a long-term threat to the to portions of the aquifer in that area. So that is something that I think there could be some discussions down the line with the state, because the state of Colorado, because they're impairing our groundwater quality.
Okay. So Jorge Alejandro says, and also asking, I assume the increment in groundwater restriction is obviously related to the public and industrial demand. If the goal is to establish sustainable condition in the aquifers, is there any investment in doing an integral environmental and socio-economical focus into this kind of problems?
Well, I didn't hear the whole question, but if
you want me, I can repeat you the last the last part that is the question.
Okay.
He says, is there any investment in doing an integral environmental and socio-economical focus into this kind of problems?
Yes, there is. I just presented the groundwater hydrology portion of it. This is a multidimensional effort. There are agricultural economists, sociologists, a whole range of folks looking at this. And one of the points that I didn't make, but I should have, is in this one area, this 256 square kilometer area, they reduced pumping. It turned out their goal was 20, and so far they've done 30%. They have made just as much money, even though they reduced pumping, than just as much as their neighbors, and maybe even a little bit more. And that's a result of ag economists' assessments. I mean, that's an initial period, so maybe that won't hold for the entire, if they hit drought, whatever. But that's this type of analyses that are being done to, because that is what encourages people. That is really what encouraged the expansion of this program. Is one, they could see that the folks who were doing this, they were extending the lifespan of the aquifer, and they weren't paying a monetary penalty for it. And the reason is, it's basically precision agriculture, only giving the plants water when they absolutely needed it. And they've done a very nice job in a variety of different things, a little shift in crop mixes, etc. And so, yes, this is an area that is very important. And I'm involved in a large project that's funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the National Science Foundation, and that has a multidisciplinary team to look at these issues. So yes, that is an integral part, and the economic side of things is critical. And that's what, we need to show that this is not going to be a real, people aren't going to be penalized heavily by making these reductions.
Okay, Oscar Villalba is asking, in Kansas, what is the most important source for drinking water?
Well, it depends on where you are. In western Kansas, it's the High Plains Aquifer, where in eastern Kansas, we have a system of reservoirs. In Kansas, we have a great change in annual precipitation from western Kansas to eastern Kansas. So I'm in eastern Kansas, and I'm in a humid climate. I mean, we get a lot of rainfall here, and whereas in western Kansas, it's semi-arid. So in western Kansas, they go with the groundwater. In eastern Kansas, we go with surface reservoirs for the most part. We do have some contribution from the groundwater and the alluvial aquifers associated with the major river, but most of it is reservoirs. And there is, of course, the problem with those reservoirs silting up, but that's a whole different issue. But that's where things stand at this point.
Okay, I think that from the audience, we don't have more questions, but I do have one. And is, I know that there are some oil and gas fields in Kansas, and I want to ask you if you know about the regulation for the groundwater related to the oil and gas industry, for example, for injection or for fracturing or something like that.
Well, you can get in Kansas, you can get a temporary permit for water use for oil and gas applications, for like drilling wells or injection. If the water's available, you can get a temporary permit. We do have a problem in this portion of Kansas that I'm circling with the cursor. This is an area where a lot of horizontal fracking is done, and there have been a fair number of earthquakes associated with the activity of those wells, not the fracking per se, but the disposal of the salt water. Because in Kansas, when you pump a petroleum well, it's like 90% salt water, 90% or more salt water, and then you've got the oil. And so you have to separate out the two, and then they inject the salt water back into a deep saline aquifer. And the pressures have built up, and as a result, there have been earthquakes. I think the largest, and I'm just speaking from memory here, so I could be off, I think it approached certainly in the upper fours in terms of magnitudes of the earthquakes as a result of that. We have not had a great deal of contamination in the modern era, as far as we know, due to soil and gas operations. However, previously, that salt water was disposed in so-called evaporation pits on the land surface, and that was particularly true in this area. And so there's groundwater contamination as a result of that salt water infiltrating down into the aquifer. But that practice stopped, I believe, in the 1930s. But still, that contamination is there, and it creates some problems.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. I think that we have another question from Marco. Marco is asking, are there prohibition zones related to vulnerable sectors in the aquifers?
Yeah, there are some. The vulnerable areas have been identified, and there are restrictions on pumping. Those have been not put in place in Western Kansas, believe it or not, for the most part. They've been put in place in these areas here. And I guess it's just a political issue that there's been a lot of resistance to cutting back or just curtailing groundwater pumping in certain areas. But the regulatory agency has the authority to do that, but they have not implemented that authority in some of these highly stressed areas.
Okay, we have another question from Oscar. He is asking, in Kansas, what is the priority in the use of water?
What is the priority? Well, it's clear. It's for irrigated agriculture. That is the primary use. I mean, all of the communities in Western Kansas depend on groundwater for their drinking water supply, but there's just not enough of them to make a big difference with respect to irrigation pumping. That is by far the primary use of groundwater in Western Kansas.
Okay, so Luis Camilo is asking, what can we do as a hydrogeologist to fix this kind of problems with the current needs of the population?
This is the challenge. This is the huge challenge that we face. And I think we're going to have to be moving beyond agriculture and kind of the standard practices of agriculture. We're going to have to be more flexible. I think crop choices, we're going to have to change some of the crops that we're producing because you know, with the increasing population and the shift in dietary habits, global change, climate change, excuse me, this is going to put a real stress on our aquifers. And so we have got to figure out a different crop mix, in my opinion, to move forward. And so we're hopeful that technology and maybe some crop genetics can help out and you know, move us forward. It's unclear at this point, but that is a huge challenge for us. There's just no getting around it, and no one has come up with a great solution, as indicated by the stress that so many of the aquifers around the world are dealing with.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers. I think that are all the questions for now. We really appreciate your time, your intention to transfer and to share your knowledge. Very, very, very good presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And I just again wish everyone the best under these very difficult situations that we're all facing. And we just have to stay positive. So my thoughts are with you all. So take care.
Okay, thank you so much. I will appreciate for the people that is listening that please help us fill in the survey. I mean, the survey of each talk. And remember that tomorrow we will be with our second talk from this week at the same time through this channel. Thank you so much.